All right, folks, let's get you updated on the AP poll top 25. And this will be the last one before we get the first edition of the college football rankings on Tuesday. Oregon, with its win over Utah on the road, moves up 2 spots to number 6, according to the writers. Oklahoma, with its loss to Kansas, goes from 6 to 10. If we continue the conversation from 11 to 20, Oregon State loses to Arizona, which moves them 5 spots down. And I mentioned the Utes, with Barnes at quarterback, not able to compete there with the Ducks. Kyle Whittingham and company, they're dropping 5 spots to 18. And then lastly, we've got a couple of newcomers with Kansas and Kansas State coming into the ranked matchup. And James Madison continues to win out, but of course, a bowl will not be in their sights. And Southern California, a 50-49 win against the Cal Bears. What's good, streaming people? I'm Tommy Tran, joined by Brady Quinn and our CFP analyst, Jerry Palm. Guys, great to be with you. Let's first start with Oregon, because that was a top matchup there. Brady, I'll start with you. What stood out to you was a fairly convincing win there by Dan Lanning and company?
Yeah, look, I mean, on the road, a tough place to play there. Rice Eccles is playing at altitude versus one of the better defenses in college football, and Kyle Whittingham has been the 2-time Pac-12 champ. He usually finds ways of getting wins, but they were just dominated by an Oregon team that's more talented, had better speed on the outside, and the difference maker ultimately to me was Bo Nix at quarterback. I mean, his ability not only to run and do some of his legs, but the downfield passing game to me showed up, the defense as well, that running game. They're one of the top 4 teams the way they're playing right now. They're not ranked that way, but we get the college football playoff rankings coming out here just in a couple of days. So we'll see where the college football playoff committee has them ranked, but no doubt about it, they're playing some of the best football of anyone.
We'll have that conversation in just a second. Jerry, maybe bring you in terms of, we saw the Riders move the Ducks up a couple of spots to 6, still behind the team that they lost to out at Husky Stadium. What did you think about the move, and what were your impressions of Oregon over the weekend?
Yeah, it's a really impressive win. I mean, Utah had won 18 games in a row at home. I mean, this is a very tough place to win, and they went in and they dominated. And it's a great performance. It's going to be a standout on their resume, even at the end of the year, their tournament resume at the end of the season. So, yeah, it's the kind of a thing that's definitely going to get the attention of the committee, and you could argue it's their best win so far this season because of who they played and where they played them.
And it helps perhaps, too, if you have a Heisman candidate. They certainly have that with Bo Nix, who could end up being, Brady, a finalist. What kind of Heisman statement was made by Bo over the weekend?
Yeah, again, I mean, he might set the NCAA completion percentage record this season. I mean, it's remarkable what he's been able to do in the passing game. And you look at over the course of time, since he's been at Oregon, coming into this past week's game, 65 total touchdowns just during his time at Oregon, to 8 interceptions. He added on to that this past week. So he's been phenomenal. He's a good decision maker. He seems to be able to step up in the big moments. I think you go back to that Washington loss, the only thing you're questioning there is Dan Lanning's decision making and going for some of those 4th downs instead of taking the points when they had them, and maybe you get a different outcome. But right now, you'd have to say Bo Nix is up there amongst the Michael Penix of the world, maybe even a Marvin Harrison Jr. outside of the quarterback position for who should be considered or a finalist for the Heisman Trophy when it's all said and done this year.
Let's get to a team that slipped this weekend in Oklahoma, which had already survived a scare against UCF, Jerry. They go to Lawrence and they lose to Kansas, so the writers have them go from 6 to 10. Did you think that was warranted? What were your thoughts about the Sooners with their loss there on the road?
Yeah, I don't think they're a team that would have dropped too far. I mean, Kansas isn't bad. That's a pretty decent team. So it's not like losing to UCF. A loss to them would have really been damaging in terms of the polls and in terms of how the committee viewed them. So I don't think it's that bad of a loss. And you had a kind of a weird circumstance with a big rain delay in the middle of the game. Not quite the Purdue-Virginia Tech rain delay, but still, it throws everybody off. So I don't think it's a big deal that they've lost that game. And I think the committee will be kinder to them than the polls are, because the committee will remember that they beat Texas.
It's a really interesting point by Jerry, too, because if you look at, obviously, where Oregon rises to after their best win, they still sit behind Washington, a team they lost to, whereas Texas sits now ahead at number 7 in the AP poll versus Oklahoma, who drops to 10 in this case. And it kind of set up for the perfect storm, if you will, given the weather there in Lawrence, Kansas. But, you know, Kansas coming off of a bye, a little extra time to prepare, and just enough wrinkles and enough things went their way in the end to be able to get the win versus Oklahoma. But look, Oklahoma's very much still in the hunt for all of this, especially in the Big 12. No one's out of it right now. We were having a little trivia before. You've got Texas with 1 loss, Oklahoma with 1 loss, K-State, the defending champs, still with 1 loss, and then Iowa State, who's not a part of the rankings, but a lot of college football left to be played. A lot of things could happen down the stretch here.
You know, we're going to get to sort of big picture stuff, but just to piggyback off your point about the Big 12, Jerry, where does the Big 12 as a whole sit right now? Because it doesn't feature a team that is undefeated, but you've got a lot of quality teams with one loss and a chance to get through the rest of the schedule and have a chance to crack the top 4.
Well, if you're talking about making the college football playoff, one loss overall is about all you can take. It's going to be hard to get a 2-loss team into a college football playoff unless we have kind of an Armageddon year where teams are losing all over the place. But this year doesn't look like that. So, Texas and Oklahoma, they're done as far as the ability to lose and still make the college football playoff. And if the Big 12 produces a team that's got more than one loss, they're not going to make the college football playoff this year.
We've never seen a 2-loss team make it. So, I mean, granted, we might give a little more leeway to an SEC champ, a Big Ten champ, depending on those 2 losses and who they're to. But the reality is, at this point, we just have not seen that in the college football playoff. Until there's expansion, I don't think we're going to either.
A couple of notes here in the top 25, and then we're going to go big picture, getting ready for Tuesday. Duke and North Carolina dropping out. Carolina now back-to-back losses there for Mac Brown and Drake May. Jerry, I know on CBSSports.com this week you put together a list of your teams and where they're at in terms of the college football playoff. Now, again, it wasn't a final projection. It was sort of a as is. And I only bring that up because you had, I believe, Georgia at the time at 6. They have a nice win against Florida here. As we sort of hit the reset button as of today, with room for you to change from now until even Tuesday, just give me the lay of the land, the early leans for you of where we set maybe your top 5 and top 10.
Yeah, my top 5 are probably going to be roughly the same as last week, except for Oklahoma will drop out. So Michigan 1, Ohio State 2, Florida State 3, Washington 4, and Georgia 5. And you can order these teams in almost any way, but Georgia can't be one because Georgia's schedule is the worst of those 5, or at least it was before you added Florida to it. And they're not dominating their schedule the way that Michigan is. I mean, Michigan is just laying waste to everyone. And even though these are not great teams, it's still complete domination. So that's what you have to do when you have Michigan's schedule. They have the better test coming up. But for right now, it would be, for me, Michigan 1, Ohio State 2, and Ohio State has got better quality wins for sure. But Michigan's overall dominance, to me right now, is too hard to ignore.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's a couple of teams you kind of throw into consideration based on what the College Football Playoff Committee uses as the eye test, right? We see how dominant a team like Michigan is, even though they had a softer schedule. You could make that same case for Georgia, although they looked fantastic this past week in a rivalry game, even without their best player in Brock Bowers. Maybe some of the other injuries and guys coming back obviously helped their case, but Georgia's going to get the benefit of the doubt, given that the fact that they're the 2-time defending champs, and Kirby Smart's one hell of a coach, and it looks like they're still on top of the college football world. I wouldn't be shocked if Ohio State wasn't number 1, though. I think when we always come out and see this first iteration of the College Football Playoff Committee's rankings, we usually see them respect the strength of schedule first. And Ohio State's undefeated. They have 2 top 10 wins now over Notre Dame, over Penn State. That's as good as anyone in college football. I think Washington, who Jerry's got there pretty high up too, with their big win over Oregon, I think that's going to bode well for them, even though they've struggled of late now to kind of separate themselves from some teams. But as you take a look at this Buckeyes team, they've got a formula right now that kind of reminds you more of the last time they won a national championship in 2014 in the college football playoff. They've got the ground attack, especially with Travion Henderson back, his explosiveness we saw this past week, that defense. And then on top of it, they've got a playmaker in Marvin Harrison Jr., who seems like when they need to dial something up and they need a big play, he's the guy they go to. They did it this past week versus Wisconsin. You saw it versus Penn State. Ohio State's going to be really an interesting team to see where the College Football Playoff Committee sees them ranked because of how strong they've been, at least in regards to their resume thus far, whereas Michigan still has their best games ahead of them. You can make the case for some of the teams in the Pac-12 as well.
Jerry, what do you think about what Brady just had to say there?
Well, I would just say that Georgia's not going to get the benefit of the doubt for what they've done the last 2 years. That's not criteria. Now, they're really going to be judged solely on what they've done this year. And what they've done this year is good. I mean, they're a very good team. They're the number 1 team in the polls because of what they've done the last 2 years. But their resume doesn't really measure up to the teams that I think are going to be ahead of them. Now, they could be, maybe 3, maybe 4. I mean, I think you could make an argument for there, but I don't really see much of an argument for Georgia to be ahead of either Michigan or Ohio State right now, which to me are clearly the top 2. And then it's, do you like the strength of schedule and the quality wins, or do you like the utter dominance of Michigan? I think the committee could go either way with those two.
I differ in the sense that I think if you look at the SEC top down, bottom, it looks like the best conference. Now, we can debate whether or not where the Pac-12 is going to be because they've had the most teams ranked inside the top 25. But the reality is I think there's most people who sit there and look at college football as a whole seem to give a little bit more weight to going through an SEC schedule undefeated thus far, even with the SEC East being down, or the West for that matter, not being quite as strong. So I differ with Jerry in that opinion. I think a lot of people look at Georgia and the fact that they're still undefeated, they're still doing what they've done, despite the fact that a lot of first-round picks and people have moved on. I think they still give Kirby Smart and that team a lot of credit for the way they responded this year. And you might be able to make the case that with Beck at quarterback, they might be even more explosive throwing the football downfield in comparison to what they had in Stetson Bennett.
It's interesting because it's still relatively early. It usually always plays itself out. But what's different, unlike, again, last year, the Pac-12 and the ACC made way for an additional team to get in, like an Ohio State with a Michigan to get in the top 4. So there's going to be plenty of time to talk about what ifs and scenarios. I do want to ask you, Jerry, because it'll be a question about Florida State. The rest of the way, the schedule is not great for the Noles, but there's this thought that as long as they're from the ACC, undefeated, champion and all that, that they should garner one of those 4 spots. Is that where you stand at the moment?
I think if they actually do finish undefeated, their resume will stand up. This is a team that's got a non-conference win against LSU too. So, and that's a pretty good team. So as long as they don't fall apart and make that win look less than it is, I think that Florida State, as an undefeated team, is going to make the college football playoff. And I'll just say, I don't think they will ever leave out an undefeated major conference team unless they have too many to put in.
I agree with Jerry in that sentiment. I mean, regardless of strength of schedule, if they go undefeated, they're in. There's no questions, ifs, ands, or buts about it. Florida State, if they go undefeated. Now, if you do drop a game somewhere here and there, and that's another thing to kind of look at with this first iteration of the college football playoff rankings is how are they judging the one-loss teams? Is Oregon going to end up being that highest-ranked one-loss team because of who their loss came to, where it was at, how tight that game was, and how dominant Oregon's been besides that? Those are all questions that we're going to find out come Halloween night, and we're get a sense of, but that's the reality of the situation is when you lose a game, Jerry said earlier, you have zero room for error if you are a conference champion. However, it still doesn't mean we might not get a one-loss conference champ for the Pac-12, ACC, Big 12, and then we might be kind of jockeying for positions because the SEC and Big 10 are going to get their conference champion in. Then you got 3 other teams that could be potential one-loss champs biting for those last 2 spots, and then we'll see what that pushing and shoving looks like when it's all said and done.
So let's wrap up there. Again, looking ahead to Tuesday, I'm going to give you guys one each. It can be a team, it can be a conference, it can be a storyline or an angle, Jerry. Between now and Tuesday, what are you looking out for most?
Well, on Tuesday, I think what I want to see is how the one-loss teams get ranked. I'm not so worried about the undefeated teams because that is a way of sorting each other out. But the one-loss teams, you've got a lot of head-to-head going on among that group of teams. Now, Oregon doesn't have that, but Oklahoma beat Texas, Texas beat Alabama, Alabama beat Mississippi. And the committee usually does respect head-to-head when you're talking about only one loss and you haven't got something else that overwhelms that. And so I think that's why Oklahoma might get treated better by the committee than the polls treated them because of who they beat and who those other teams have beaten and how you're going to have to order these teams if you're going to respect head-to-head.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing for me, and definitely carrying off what Jerry said, the one-loss teams where the rank's going to matter. We haven't seen a team outside the first college football playoff rankings, outside the top 10, since 2015 making it in the top 4. So you almost could look at this first rendition of it and say, is there going to be an opportunity for a team that's sitting at 11 or 12 to be able to make their way up as a one-loss team? And there's a lot of football left to be played. Some of these schedules are kind of backloaded with these different conferences. But outside of the one-loss teams, I'd say the strength of the conference. Like we've really come away every single week saying Pac-12, Pac-12, Pac-12. In this last year of what we know as the Pac-12, they've had so many teams consistently ranked in the top 25. Will that be how the College Football Playoff Committee continues to look at this conference? And then given the schedule down the stretch for so many teams who could be in the mix when you're looking at the Oregons and Washingtons of the world, how those quality wins are viewed in the eye of the committee.
Brady, thank you. Jerry, certainly appreciate your time as always, too, checking in here on HQ. And as we wrap things up, a couple more notes here from notable line movements. Again, Georgia ranked #1 in the polls for the 20th straight week. They actually went up with first place votes from 38 to 48 after that win over Florida in Jacksonville on Saturday. We know Michigan was idle this week. They actually lost a little bit of ground, as I mentioned, in the first place votes department, but not certainly in the eyes of some of our analysts.